Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in private practice in Harley Street in central London in the United Kingdom. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Alexander Todorov, who has written a fascinating book entitled Face Value, The Irresistible Influence of First Impressions. And this book is published by Princeton University Press. Alexander Todorov is professor of psychology at Princeton University, where he is also affiliated with the Princeton Neuroscience Institute and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. His research on first impressions has been covered by media around the world, including the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Daily Telegraph, Scientific American, PBS, and NPR. He lives in Princeton. So, Professor Todorov, fascinating book. I found it a gripping read from beginning to end. Let's begin with the beginning of the book. The book starts with you as a university professor in your office, and there's a TV camera crew that's interviewing you. And they're interviewing you because there's worldwide attention based on this idea that you can predict the outcome of election results, national election results, anywhere in the world, simply from an analysis of the faces of the candidates. So that's a bit of a headline, which I'm sure covers a multitude of sins, but tell us a bit about that research.
Yeah, sure. First, thank you for having me, Raj. Well, this was a set of studies that we conducted over 10 years ago, perhaps, and these were the first studies that got me really interested in studying impressions from facial appearance. But as it turned out, if you just you simply present naive participants with pictures of politicians. In this particular case, these were United States politicians competing for Senate races. And you show them the winner and the runner-up, or the top two candidates, if you're doing it prospectively. And you simply ask the participants to point to the face that looks more competent. And individual participants are not very good. They will guess that about 56% of the time, the more competent looking politician is the person who won. But if you aggregate across a relatively small sample of participants in the order of 40 or so, we can predict about 70% of the election outcomes.
So what's happening is that it looks like the facial appearance of candidates is having a massive influence or impact on the judgment of the electorate in terms of their judgment of the character or personality attributes of the candidate. And we'll get into a bit more detail into what judgments they're coming to. But that's the bottom line point, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, follow-up work by political scientists shows that, in fact, this is not the case for every single voter, but the voters who are particularly influenced by appearance are those who are highly unknowledgeable. They basically know next to nothing about politics, so they're not really invested. And especially those who don't know nothing and who watch a lot of TV. So this is a fairly plausible psychological mechanism.
What it's saying is that we are massively influenced by the impressions we form about people by people's facial appearance.
Yeah, absolutely. After this set of studies, we started very systematically to study the nature of impressions from facial appearance, and there were a number of very interesting and surprising findings. One of our first surprising findings after we found out that we can predict the electoral success of politicians based on their facial appearance was that, in fact, you need extremely little time and extremely little information to make these judgments. So we've conducted many experiments where we can manipulate the time exposure to which you can see a face. So imagine that you're in front of a computer screen and the face is flashed for less than 100 milliseconds. This is less than 1/10 of a second. And in fact, even though the presentation is extremely brief, this gives people enough information to pass a judgment. And we're not talking about physical attractiveness, which obviously is a kind of a physical characteristics of appearance, but we're talking about complex character judgments, like whether the person is trustworthy, competent, aggressive, extroverted, and so on.
So you're flashing pictures of people up so extraordinarily quickly that almost it's not even discernible, the face, when we talk about 100 milliseconds, and yet it looks like people are able to form judgments incredibly fast about faces. And you go on to speculate as to what's going on here, but certainly one of the other points you make is that a massive amount of the brain is devoted to face processing. So we're very interested, and we are biologically designed to be interested in faces.
Absolutely. I mean, faces are incredibly important social stimuli. To begin with, there are lots of studies with newborns with virtually no visual experience, and they prefer to look at faces. And very quickly, over the first few years of development, we developed specialized regions in our brains that are dedicated to the processing of facial information. So there are many, many regions, and we're not just talking, if you look at the adult studies, there are dozens and dozens of fMRI studies on face processing. There are lots of neurophysiology studies with monkeys, and there are patches in the posterior cortex that seems to be exclusively dedicated to the processing of faces. But it's not only that these visual areas are activated when we are looking at faces. We typically get activation in many other regions, including the amygdala, often prefrontal cortex, posterior superior temporal cortex. So there's a very rich network of brain regions that is triggered by the mere sight of a face.
The other point that I think is very interesting that you make is that we're coming to conclusions, but we're not aware, it seems to me, I think is the point you're making, what the conclusions are we're coming to or how we're coming to. And you do spend a little bit of time in the book discussing the fact that people come to judgments and decisions but aren't fully aware of that. And there's a famous experiment you mentioned where in the experiment, I think the researchers train people to remember word pairs. Like I think you give the example of moon and ocean. And then they're asked a little bit later to give the name of a detergent, and moon and ocean, there's an association with the word tide, and they tend to say the word tide as the name of a famous brand of detergent, but they don't realize that what's happened is through unconscious processing, they've been influenced by the experimenter to come up with the word tide. Could you say a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So this is actually a very old ideas from the 70s. It was a classic paper by Richard Nisbet and Timothy Wilson, telling more than we can know. And that's precisely the point. And judgment from faces is a kind of a perfect example of this phenomena. For example, you can manipulate the facial features and ask people to make judgments, and you manipulate the features in a way that influences their judgments in a predictable way. And then you can ask them, well, what is your judgment based on? And people have no idea. And we know that because we have manipulated the features. Often they will provide a lay theory. I think it's the eyes, although the eyes could be identical across stimuli. And the fact that, in fact, you can form these judgments after extremely brief presentation of a face very clearly suggests that people have very hard time. They cannot possibly articulate what the judgment is based on. I mean, it's a kind of automatic pattern matching. And if you ask people, they will provide some theory, but most likely it's not going to be accurate.
And again, what's really fascinating about this work is because this is going on below conscious awareness, there's a potential, and I'm a bit nervous about your book that you've published this stuff in terms of what's going to happen next, because there's another bit of the book, fascinating, devoted to the fact you can manipulate using computer technology and face processing software. You can manipulate the appearance of someone like the former president of the United States, Obama. You can manipulate his face subtly that will dramatically and reliably generate a different impression in the viewer. So there's a real opportunity here for politicians to manipulate the electorate, it seems to me.
Well, I think that people have been doing it for years, perhaps in not very subtle ways. But I mean, we just recently had an election, and you get often these vignettes from the other. It usually will have commercials from one political party, and if you just look at the images of the opposing party, they're really unflattering. So the simplest and very old technique, which has been around since we had photography, is essentially to use images that are unflattering, because this is an interesting phenomena that one thing that we also kind of underestimate. We sort of assume that each image is a representative of the person, and that kind of rings true for familiar faces, but it is complete nonsense when it comes to unfamiliar faces. In terms of the computer techniques, yes, we can. We've conducted lots of studies. We can actually use mathematical models to visualize different kinds of impressions, and then you can apply these models to a real face and make it look more or less trustworthy, more or less dominant. You can, I mean, lots of people who do this in the digital retouching industry, and some of them are pretty amazing, but you can actually do empirical studies and figure it out based on purely psychophysical studies. What are the parts of the image that you can change so you can make the face appear more trustworthy or less trustworthy, more dominant, and so on?
Now, this stuff has real practical impacts, implications in the real world. So the other bit of the book that was also very fascinating was looking at court cases, legal cases, and the outcome. And you talk about some fascinating research looking at inmates on death row and how their faces might be a bit different from people who get off. And juries and the court process may be being influenced by the facial appearance of defendants in the dock. Could you say a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. This was a set of fairly recent studies with quite dramatic findings, and many states in the United States actually post the pictures of their prisoners, so they're publicly available. And a research group from Canada downloaded all of the images of prisoners from Florida and identified those prisoners who were sentenced to death and prisoners who were sentenced to life without parole for the same crime, murder. And so the only difference was some of them got the death penalty and some of them didn't. And after controlling for a number of obvious variables like race, age, attractiveness, they found out that one characteristic that seemed to distinguish these two groups of convicted people was how trustworthy they appeared. So the prisoners who happened to look, quote unquote, untrustworthy or more untrustworthy ended up more likely to get the death penalty.
And I thought there was also some very interesting work on people who were wrongfully convicted. People have found out to have been wrongfully convicted.
So there was a fascinating
facial appearance.
Yeah, so they actually identified, they identified a small subsample of convicted people who later happened to be falsely convicted. And luckily, none of them got executed, so this was found on time. And again, they happened to have this quote-unquote untrustworthy appearance.
So it looks like one of the themes in the book is that we are continually forming judgments of character from people's facial appearance. And your argument is that this is a mistake, that we can form certain judgments from faces like the emotional state a person might be in. And even that is a little bit dodgy, but you're saying be aware that what faces were there for in terms of the built structure of the face, we'll come on to this in a minute, why we have eyebrows, for example. I thought that bit was fascinating. Until I read your book, I always was perplexed by what the point of an eyebrow was. Now I understand what eyebrows are there for. And again, your book kind of unlocks these mysteries in a really beautiful way. But
thank you.
I think your argument is that our faces are actually designed to communicate stuff like emotions and maybe intent at any one moment in time, but they are not there to communicate basic character. And we're making a fundamental error. And one of the reasons we're making that error is that people that we're familiar with, we know their character, and we form a link between our understanding of those people's characters, like your wife or your children, who you know really well, and their facial appearance. And then you extrapolate erroneously that link to other people you don't know well and draw conclusions about character from their facial appearance. I hope I've got the argument right there.
Yeah, you totally got it right. That is exactly a big part of the argument that I'm making in the book. And we're completely unaware how differences in the image quality or any kind of subtle differences in images of unfamiliar people have tremendous effects on our impressions. and which is completely different with familiar people. And we kind of assume that, in fact, there's this direct link between what we see and the character of the person, which is true in most of the cases of familiar people, because their images unlock our memories and our feelings toward them. But this is completely different when we are talking about unfamiliar people. I mean, in fact, you can generate, often we can't tell whether different images of the same person belong to the same person or to different people. And some of the images make the person look completely very attractive and trustworthy and likable, and you can get completely different effect with a different set of images. And so we're getting too much. We're making too much information out of too little knowledge. After all, this kind of a single snapshots, which are defined within a very, very small segment of time.
And this has big practical implications, I think, is your argument. So, for example, many people who just have the wrong face and people are coming to the wrong conclusion about them won't make it through job interviews when perhaps they're just as talented as the people with the right face. And maybe people on dates, people will form the wrong impression or make bad judgments about them, drawing the wrong conclusion just using their faces and being unaware of that. And as a result, our lives, our life journey, it could be being sent down the wrong route by these errors we're making in coming to conclusions about people, because a big part of our lives is person perception. What we judge is going on in terms of the character of the people around us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, the fact is that we form these impressions instantaneously. Often we are kind of unaware. It's just something fairly automatic. And they do have the potential to influence judgment, especially if we have kind of ambiguous information. And this can have consequential effects. So it's important. The first step is to be aware of the potential for this kind of bias, and to look beyond the first appearance, especially if you're talking about an important decision like a hiring decision.
Now, let's go to the design of faces. I thought this was a particularly fascinating part of the book, that things that we take for granted are all there for a reason. There's a reason why our eyes are the shape they are, because our eyes are flatter in terms of the shape than most primates. And that's something to do with our environment, that we were walking around on the ground as opposed to primates that hang from trees. And it's something to do with horizontal scanning. And then there's something to do with the fact that the whites of our eyes, the sclera of our eyes, highlights a contrast and the rest of the face. So in other words, we can spot more easily than other primates what we're looking at, and gaze sends a lot of information. And then there's the fact that our faces are not hairy, and therefore that allows skin color to be sent as a message in terms of whether we're blushing, etc., etc. And then there's the fact that our faces aren't hairy, means the eyebrows are allowed to send a lot of information. And in fact, again, a very fascinating part of the book is the eyebrows are probably more important than the eyes as a window to the soul. We focus on the eyes, but actually it's the eyebrows that are doing most of the work in terms of sending information about intent and emotional states. Could you say something about that stuff, the design of the face?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, first I reviewed a lot of evidence, the research, whether in fact we can make the argument that the face evolved to signal these character dispositions, and there's very little that supports these kinds of presupposition. But at the same time, there's lots of evidence that the structures of our faces facilitate the communication and understanding of momentary mental states. And all of the specific features that you describe have to do with this. So there's a fascinating set of studies comparing comparative studies across different species. And as you mentioned, first of all, the shape of the eye in primates is a function of the environment. So primates who live largely in trees, they happen to have very round eyes. And primates that live mainly on the ground, like us, we have highly elongated eyes. And there's a very simple hypothesis that can explain these changes in the eyes. In fact, it's more efficient, especially if you're an upright animal, it's much more, and a large animal, it's much more efficient to move your eyeballs rather than your whole head. And hence, you have elongated eyes, which allows for more horizontal scanning. But one of the most interesting findings from this set of studies is that, as you mentioned, we're the only primate with whites of the eye. So, in fact, this makes the iris much more visible and makes detection of eye gaze very easy, which is very different than the rest of the other primates, where often it's kind of hard to see the eye gaze. And it's not obviously, we can't have a completely proved story why this is the case, but a very plausible story is that it has to do with social communication. Because with eye gaze, we can share attention, we can attract your attention, we can communicate through distance, and it's a very, very important social signal, which in combination with other social signals can carry lots of information. The eyebrows, as you said, it's a very interesting case because, in fact, not only for emotional expressions, but even for recognition of faces, if you take a face and you remove a famous face and you remove their eyebrows, they're much harder to recognize than if you remove their eyes, which is counterintuitive. And the only way you would know this if you actually do an experiment. And this is one of the reasons my book has lots of images, because it's everything makes sense once you see the images and the demonstrations. And when we express emotional expressions, well, the eyebrows move. I mean, not only when it's only emotional expressions, but when you're exercising kind of a hard cognitive mental effort. And so they're signaling, and we have large foreheads because of our enlarged forebrain. And there were lots of 18th, 19th century racist theories what this means and how close different races to humans that turn out to be false. But the fact that we have these large flat foreheads makes the detection of the movement of the eyebrows very easy, coupled with the fact that we are the hairless primates. And all of these things facilitate the perception of emotions. There are lots of other interesting findings. It turns out that among mammals, only the primates have trichromatic visions, and not all primates have trichromatic visions. And there are many different evolutionary hypotheses why is that the case. But one interesting fact is that however this evolved, it makes it, if you have a trichromatic vision, so seeing in red, green, and blue, it's much easier to detect an hairless face. This happened to correlate actually across species with how hairy the face is or how hairless the face is. It's much easier to detect changes in mental states. And you can also think of blushing, but also when you are sleep deprived, when you're sick, the complexion of your skin changes in subtle ways. But these are all states that they're not stable states in contrast to character, which is something that's it's supposed to be stable across time and situations. So all of these changes seem to facilitate the reading of momentary mental states, which has always been informative throughout our human history.
Now, I think that you mount an argument in the book to explain why there's a fundamental error going on in the modern era in this constant attempt, and it keeps coming back. And again, there's a brilliant examination of the history of physiognomy, that the notion of trying to derive character from face, and it keeps coming back again and again. Almost each generation rediscovers this falsity, if we can put it that way. You mount an argument that basically throughout human history, we lived in small communities. We lived in small villages of about 150 people. We were born there, we lived there, we died there. So there was no need for faces to communicate character because you grew up with people around you, you knew their characters. Now, in modern geographically mobile societies, urban societies, which really only existed for the last 200 years or so, where you meet people for job interviews or for dates, where you have never met them before, and you have to form judgments rapidly about strangers, basically, a lot of the time, it makes sense that we might start to have to work hard and try to figure out people's character, and we make this erroneous leap that we can do it from people's faces. I think, again, I want to check I've captured the argument there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, physiognomy has a long history, but this history starts with the emergence of modern states. We're talking about within the last 7,000, 13,000 years. But this is the first time in the human history when you have to live with strangers. And most of our evolutionary history we actually, as you mentioned, we lived in small groups where you have lots of first-hand accounts and second-hand accounts information, and you don't need to rely on appearance. But the need to rely on appearance really emerges once we start to live with strangers. If you imagine the human evolution compressed within 24 hours, we in fact have lived with strangers only for the last 5 minutes of the day or less. The rest of the time, we didn't have to live with strangers. As Jared Diamond had a nice line in one of his books that with the emergence of modern states, this was the first time we had to live to encounter strangers without trying to kill them. And before, the main distinction is somebody part of my tribe or not. And this is no longer the case. And living with strangers, being surrounded by strangers is scary. I mean, if you think about the problems that we faced, again, there's a great book on baboons metaphysics by Cheney and Zafer, and they said most of the problems that other baboons face could be summarized with 2 words: other baboons. And this is much more true for humans. And this is something that once you live with strangers, it's impossible to know them. It's impossible to have knowledge about all of them. So we need to rely on shortcuts. And in the past, a lot of these shortcuts had to do with attire. I mean, social class was designated by lots of symbols, and you can tell a lot about these other characteristics, not necessarily from the face, but because our natural attention is focused on the face, we often end up misattributing that whatever we get from any other information in the world, in your attire, demeanor, and the situation, we attributed that the information may come actually from your facial appearance.
Now, I mean, I take the argument, and the argument is mounted very passionately throughout the book, but I want to put something to you, which is actually your battle is not just with the public, but with other psychologists. You show that actually psychologists themselves are prone to do a lot of research where they try to back up the idea that you can derive character from facial appearance. And again, there's a wonderful strand in the book about masculinity, and there's a kind of ratio, FWHR, I think. There's a ratio of the height to the width of the face.
Width to height ratio, yes.
That's right, which is linked to masculinity and therefore linked to aggression.
Right.
And you, the battle in the book is also with other psychologists, isn't it? Because psychologists are finding it difficult to let go of this idea.
Well, yes. I mean, it's very interesting. There has been like a huge proliferation of research in this area, and it wasn't such a big area just 10, 15 years ago. And I think part of this was that once we were able to actually mathematically model this impression so we can visualize them, we can really, and we've always claimed, look, we are visualizing different kinds of stereotypes. Here's your stereotypes of extroversion, of trustworthiness, and so on. But suddenly this opened lots of other gates or kind of opened the Pandora box. And just like the old physiognomists, there has been a number of researchers thinking, well, maybe it's not just about stereotypes. Maybe it's really some kind of capturing the personality of the people. And there's been lots of studies on things like whether you can tell people from their sexual orientation, political orientation, masculinity. Well, masculinity is kind of clear, but whether masculinity signals aggressiveness. And so all of these things have been happening in the last 15, 20 years. And the width to height ratio was an interesting measure because presumably the original idea was that it has to do with sexual dimorphism. That is gender differences that evolved because of mate competition, and hence was a signal of aggressiveness. And by the way, after my book was published, there was a recent paper that looked at about 150,000 images. And these people filled out 55 different personality questionnaires. And it turns out that there's basically, for 55 different personality measures, gigantic sample size. And this ratio is uncorrelated with virtually everything. And whenever it's correlated, the correlations are super tiny and in the opposite direction of the theory that these people are supposed to be more criminal, more prone to violence or criminal behavior. But yes, I think it's kind of hard to let go of this idea, and there's studies, and in fact, it has gotten worse. I mean, because now we have the use of artificial intelligence. People say, oh, look, psychology show that people can do it. So if people can do it, we can now use deep neural network algorithms, and they can do even better. So this is not going to go away, unfortunately.
But I also thought that given, even if it's an error that people are making, what's interesting is they tend to converge on the same error. What I mean by that is they tend to come as a group to the same conclusions about what facial features mean. So it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, there's a lovely bit in the book about, I think it's the facial appearance of certain chief executives. And it turns out that actually what happens is they end up earning more, but from their companies, but they don't actually end up running the company any better. But clearly there's something about their facial appearance that's led the people within the company to believe that they're being led by better chief executives, although that may not be true. So isn't there a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy element to this?
Yeah, absolutely. Self-fulfilling prophecies are very important, and in many cases where you can actually find correlations between appearance and personality, often it has to do with self-fulfilling prophecies. I mean, if you always treat it in a negative way, you might end up not trusting other people because you don't expect to be treated positively, and you can kind of reciprocate with this negative behaviors, which sort of fulfill exactly the initial expectations of the perceiver. So yes, this is an unfortunate fact.
So I think that one of the key take-home messages for people from your book, and I want to check what you'll think about this, is forget trying to work out character from people's facial appearance. You could maybe have a go at working out character from other things, but not their faces, although that may seem very salient to you. But what you should focus on and pay attention to is the fact that the face probably can help you work out people's emotional states. And focus on that. Don't get distracted by character. And if you focus on current emotional state, current intention, then you're going to do a much better job because your resources will be devoted to something that is meaningful, and that will be more helpful in terms of as a way of getting on with people.
Yeah, in general, this is true. I mean, first of all, yeah, you will get very little information in terms of character from facial appearance, and there's just, it's wrong at so many levels. I mean, I have 4 chapters discussing modern evidence, whether in fact there's anything behind that. And even about emotional expressions, it's not always, we are very good in detecting emotional expressions, but that's usually with the help of the contextual prompts. So here's a study that I discussed in the book, and a study that was conducted in my lab with Hillel Aviezer, who is a professor at Hebrew University. We simply looked up pictures of people, tennis players, but also people experiencing pain or pleasure. And if you just show the faces, people have absolutely no idea whether this tennis players just won a point or lost a point, or whether they're in pain or they're experiencing pleasure. People are completely a chance. Everything actually kind of looks negative. Now, in the case of tennis players, if you just show the bodies, they're better than chance. They can tell whether the person won or whether the person lost. The face and the bodies are not better than the bodies by themselves. So here's a surprising paradox. So when it comes to these extreme expressions of emotions, we can't even tell from the face what the feeling of the person is. But in real life, we never see this kind of disembodied face. You perceive the whole history of the situation. You see the situation on the body context provides enough information, so you never doubt for a second what is happening right now. You know. And in this case, because your focus is on the face, you kind of believe, oh yeah, it's the face. And in fact, if you ask people, well, where do you think the source of information is, they say the face. So even emotional expressions are fairly ambiguous pieces of information. And the same time, I think with face recognition, we kind of, until the last 5-6 years, we often will say, well, humans are unique in our amazing ability to recognize faces. Computer systems cannot do as well. That changed in the last 5 years or so. But we always say, well, face recognition is very special. But that's also kind of half true. We are pretty amazing at recognizing familiar faces. Once you're familiar with the face, you can stretch it, distort the image, you can remove the high spatial frequency information, so you make it very grainy, blurry, kind of a low quality image, and we have no problems recognizing these faces. But it's a real different problem when you're talking about unfamiliar faces. And it's not surprising that the main reason for false convictions of people is erroneous eyewitness testimony. We're just not very good. I mean, we can, as I mentioned earlier, Mike Burton, who is at the University of York, and Rob Jenkins have done fascinating work showing how poor we are when it comes to recognition of unfamiliar faces. And that might seem like an oxymoron, but think about just deciding whether two different images match the same face. There was a famous example which I discussed in the book. After the Boston Marathon bombing, FBI released the images of the Zuhair brothers, the perpetrators, and immediately the younger Zuhair was mistaken for a missing kid with Indian origins, Sunil Tripathi. And there were all of these hate messages, and they were like, this information was retweeted over 1,000 times in the first few hours after this was released. But it was just a normal mistake that you can predict. If you're not familiar with these people, it's very easy to mistake them. And it's just because we are so good at recognizing familiar people, we assume that we are also as good at recognizing unfamiliar people, and we are just not. And we make lots of errors. So I think we just put too much faith in the information that we get from faces. So you always need to be a little bit more modest in our decision making.
Well, Alexander Todorov, it's been fascinating talking to you. Just to repeat, before I ask you the final question, the title of the book is Face Value, The Irresistible Influence of First Impressions by Alexander Todorov, published by Princeton. And I've been reading psychology and psychiatry for over 30 years. And I have to say, this is one of the few books I've read where on every page there's a fascinating result, which even I, who I regard myself as very well read in the subject, had no idea about. Now, I'm going to ask you a question which is probably going to make you want to run screaming from the room, so brace yourself. Has this had a personal impact on you? To what extent are you aware of jumping to conclusions about people that you meet, unfamiliar people? How does it influence you at job interviews in terms of your assessment of people? And has it influenced you in terms of your own facial appearance or your own appearance? Have you consciously tried to change your appearance as a result of the fact you're aware from this research of the power, the mistaken power of faces in terms of the impact on people?
Yeah, well, in the latter part of the question, no, I haven't tried to change my appearance. I don't think that, there are different ways to, in some ways, we always change our appearance. I mean, our grooming style, what kind of clothes we wear, all of this stuff is part of how we manipulate our appearance, not in the conventional sense of the word manipulating. But no, I really never thought about that. In terms of the first question, how does affect me in terms of my own decisions? Well, I try really to avoid the influence of this information. Here's a specific example. So we always interview graduate students for work. I always hated interviews because forget even about information from facial appearance. Unstructured interviews, unstructured job interviews are almost completely useless predictor of future success and performance. The correlations of the order of 0.10, 0.15. Yet we put lots of faith in our impressions from these 15, 20 minutes interactions. Well, in the case of admitting graduate students or hiring employers, you get a lot of information. You get all of the information before you meet the candidate. I mean, in the case of graduate students, it's prior grades, research experience, their statement, letters of reference, which summarize long samples of observation. So I know who I want, and I'm not trying to decide. I never try to decide during the interview, well, do I like this person or not? And when my colleagues ask me to give my opinion about their candidates, from my interviews, I typically decline because it's useless. I mean, I can tell whether I like them or not. That doesn't mean anything in terms of how good they're going to be. So yes, in terms of practice, in terms of my own decision making, I try to limit the influence of this information.
Alexander Todorov, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.